Hello, this is the lecture for Ancient and Medieval History for Monday, April 5th, 2021. We are beginning the fourth quarter and Unit 4, all at the same time. So, it behooves us, there's a good word for SATs. Go on. Just look at this person as she goes by. She loves being on camera. Sorry, evilness. It behooves us to look at where we are in the overall scheme of things. So, Unit 4 is divided into basically 3 or 4 sections. The Dark Ages, the High Middle Ages, the Late Middle Ages, and arguably Renaissance as well, although that's sort of on the cusp of modern times. Middle Ages. What the heck does that mean? Middle in terms of what? Of what? Well, let us look at the way that historians divide up history. The first era is what we have spent all of our time on this year. It starts with the creation of the universe. But particularly in terms of people, it starts 10+ thousand years ago, 20+ thousand years ago. Thank you. During the Paleolithic era, the Old Stone Age of nomadic hunter-gatherers, where men hunt and women gather, and people wander the continents of wherever they happen to be, in pursuit of the herbs and stripping the land like human locusts. And these ancient times continue into the Neolithic era, where we discover how to farm. We domesticate plants, create food surpluses, and then domesticate animals, which creates more food surpluses, allowing us to have reliable sources of dairy and meat, as well as grains. And even vegetables can be grown through these new farming techniques. The Neolithic involves some people settling down into the first farming settlements. Then, certain technologies improve. We have the Metal Ages, the Copper Age, a sort of soft metal that can be easily molded into shapes, but still, you've got a copper knife that's going to have some advantages over a stone knife, a copper arrowhead, some advantage, or spearhead, some advantages over a stone one. But then somebody figured out to mix tin and copper together at the right heat in the right proportions, creating bronze, which is a much harder metal, able to hold an edge better. And in the Bronze Age, you have the actual Trojan War. You have the... He's just gone off. No, you have the Minoan Cretans and you have the Mycenaean Greeks. They are Bronze Age people. Odysseus wandered the Mediterranean in a Bronze Age oared galley. And then the Hittites developed ironworking in our part of the world, and so you have iron weapons. And with iron comes the possibility of learning the secret of steel. The secret of steel is summarized in this simple way. You heat iron to a certain point and create its basic shape by pounding it into shape like a hard, molten, semi-molten, not really fully molten putty. And then, when it's the right shape, you drop it into the cold, cold water. And what the molecules inside the iron do is they go, "Yee!" Like a human being on a hot summer day jumps into a cold, cold lake. There's a reaction, isn't there? Think about the last time you did that, cannonballed into an ice cold lake or pool on a hot, sweltery summer day. And if you haven't done that yet, and you've got a good heart, it's worth doing because it's kind of fun. In any event, you go, "Yeek!" Your muscles all clench, and that's what happens to the molecules. What had been rough iron becomes steel. Harder, cleaner, stronger, able to hold a much better edge. And steel. Steel is what the Romans used to conquer the known world. So you have these Metal Ages, which define some things. But you also have the development of pre-classical river valley civilizations. Instead of having towns and communities of farmers, you end up with settlements so big that without trade, people die in massive numbers. Without cities, there is no civilization. There's culture, group of people bound together by certain core beliefs, but there's not civilization, which is a culture with cities, specialized labor, writing, advanced technology, and complex institutions. Those things only come when you have cities. And the first civilizations, city cultures, are set in river valleys. In the Middle East, you've got Mesopotamia, the Tigris-Euphrates Valley, you've got Egypt, the Nile Valley. In India, you've got the Indus Valley civilizations of Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro. And in China, you've got the civilizations along the Yangtze and Huanghe rivers, which are still there. The Indian civilization gets wiped out. The Chinese civilization goes through a series of evolutionary morphings. They're still there. Our civilization goes through a series of dark ages and revisions and reformations. Why did they settle in river valleys? Well, I hope you remember. They weren't stupid. They knew they were going to get flooded out every year. They knew they were going to live in a mosquito-infested swamp. But that mosquito-infested swamp has some of the best farmland you can find anywhere. So being in a mosquito-infested swamp that floods every year, filling your home with mud, is worth it because you can grow a lot of food. And with a lot of food comes a lot of power. You get more population, you get more soldiers, you win wars, you get more treasure, and suddenly you become an empire, which is a group of cultures under one government. The last part of the ancient world is the classical Greek and Roman civilizations. From the rise of the Hellenic city-states about 6, 7, 800 BC, the development of Athens and Sparta, the wars against Persia, the wars between Athens and Sparta, Peloponnesian War, the conquest by Alexander, then the conquest of Persia, then the establishment of the Diadochi kingdoms, the Hellenistic kingdoms, in the wake of Alexander the Great's death. The rise of Rome as a republic, its wars with Carthage, death struggles, its victories over Carthage, and suddenly it's a society so rich that an everyday working man can't find a job because slaves do it. Because there are so many slaves, because there have been so many victories. You get your initial slaves from conquest and war. This rise in wealth and slavery dooms the Republic, creates the Civil War period, triumvirates, Julius Caesar and Mark Antony and Augustus, and the establishment of Rome's empire. First in its principate form, a republic or an empire with republican forms. Then the Pax Romana, a time of peak cultural and material wealth, a golden age by any other name. Then the crisis, when the fundamental flaw in Rome's compromise, which is the inability to decide that Rome is a monarchy and needs a law for succession, produces a period of 50 years of unending civil war at a time when foreign enemies in the Gothic and Persian areas really increased the danger of Rome being just destroyed and conquered. And then the establishment of a new Rome, the Dominate by Diocletian, the Tetrarchy, and then a persecution of Christians like no other. Yes, the empire is at this point transformed by Christianity, an advent or an offshoot of Judaism, which is open to anyone, whether they have Jewish blood or not. The notion that God himself, out of love, chose to enter a human life and chose to end that life at the peak of joy in life, to die a criminal's death for our sins, which is what last week was celebrated as, by most Christians, the Holy Week of Easter. The Romans had seen this as a cannibalistic sex fiend cult that stole children from their families. But in the end, the entire applied power of the Roman state isn't enough to crush the Christian faith. So what comes of it is that if you can't beat them, join them. Constantine establishes the Council of Nicaea, which is going to make the Christians come up with a common creed. The Christians are going to be set up to become the official religion of the Roman Empire. And this does strengthen Rome for a while, but it's a different Rome. Of higher regulation, of less freedom, of more taxes, of more control by the government. Ultimately, though, Rome's population problem, which is a result of everything from plague to lead pipes, causes Romans not to be able to fill their empire. And I call everyone in the Roman Empire at this point Romans because the old distinctions between different cultures no longer mattered. They were all Romans and thought were indeed Romanization had succeeded. Unfortunately, the Romans were not capable of filling their empire, so they brought in Germans and Goths. At first on their terms, but eventually the Germans and Goths says, you need us more than we need you. We come in, we're going to keep our language, our kingdoms, our customs. We'll work with you, not for you. And the Romans accept it. And ultimately, the Western Roman Empire is devoured by it. Look at the map in your notepad. It is a weirdly stapled notepad, I know that.
I didn't even get notepad.
You didn't get it, yeah, because you were doing all that handing out, which is a good reason. Does anyone else need a notepad? See, she got a notepad, even though she handed out. Okay, so the first page of maps, what you will see is on the upper left, AD 476. It's on the upper right of the map, the upper leftmost of the four maps on this page. So, AD 476 is the first map page. And let's see what Europe looks like. Well, there is the Eastern Roman Empire, which basically is intact. It includes everything in Africa, Cyrenaica, going counterclockwise to Egypt, to Judea, to Syria, to Anatolia, and even areas near Armenia, Thrace and Greece, along the lower Danube, and then south to the sea again. The Eastern Roman Empire is ruled from the city of Constantinople. So Eastern Empire doesn't fall, but the Western Empire does. Our Western civilization comes from the western part of the Roman Empire, not the Eastern. There are two chunks that are still called Western Empire. One in Illyria, what's now Croatia, and one in northern France, what we now would call the Paris region and Normandy. But those areas are going to be swallowed by the barbarian kingdom very, very, very soon. Instead, in the West, we've got, where Italy used to be, Roman Italy, we've got the kingdom of Odoacer, which is the kingdom of the Ostrogoths. Then in what is now much of France and Spain, we've got the kingdom of the Visigoths. We've got the kingdom of the Suevi near northern Portugal and northern Spain. The Basques have their own separate territory. These are a non-Indo-European language group speaking people. North of the kingdom of the Visigoths and Odoacer, you've got the Burgundians, the Alemanni, the Franks, the Saxons, and a bunch of other tribes, including the Lombards and the Gepids. So Europe is a crazy quilt. And we've got the kingdom of the Vandals in North Africa. But part of the North African coast, the Moroccan area, has been taken over by the Moorish Berbers. Britain, well, is ruled by the mythical King Arthur, or is about to be ruled by the mythical King Arthur. Britain is basically back to pre-Roman times, and they're about to be invaded by German tribes, the Anglo-Saxons and the Jutes. So what you see in place of Rome is a crazy quilt of cultures, and this map is overly simple. Because the truth is, there aren't unified organized kingdoms. These are barbarian realms. The real question is, who rules this valley? Who rules your hometown? What do you owe them? Do you owe them food? Do you owe them money? Do you owe them service? You probably owe them all three. What kind of power do they have over you? Do they treat you well, or do they treat you like a conquered person? So the Greco-Roman era in our part of the world, the western part of Europe, comes to an end in 476. Persia's still around too, by the way. Okay, let's go back to the first page. So I've given you a hint of what the Dark Ages are going to look like. But again, it's deceptively organized. The truth is, Europe is like a giant room. And there are people who are already in the room who've chosen their spots. And then a new group of people enters the room and jostles for spots. And then a new people enters the room and jostles for spots. And then a new people enters the room and jostles for spots. And fights break out between the old groups and the new groups. And sometimes a group rules a corner of the room. Sometimes a group rules the center of the room. But then that group is overwhelmed and overthrown by an alliance of... It's just chaos. It's not called the Dark Ages for nothing. If you view civilization as a light, this is the death of civilization. It's the death of Greek and Roman civilization. During the Dark Ages, there are only three lights that remain. And the only light in Western Europe is the Christian church. The Christian church is going to keep knowledge alive, but it'll only be in seed form during the Dark Ages. They'll keep knowledge alive, but they won't be using it. They'll be preserving it for a better time, for the future. Well, there's the light of the Byzantine Empire, but the Byzantine Empire doesn't see the former Western Roman Empire as Roman anymore. They see them as a bunch of barbarians ruling over the four Romans that used to live there, treating them like second-class citizens, like slaves. So the light of civilization, as the Eastern Roman Empire, has less and less to do with Western Europe as time goes on. The third light will come along with the Prophet Muhammad and the advent of the Islamic faith, the Muslim religion, which will threaten Europe with conquest and conversion to the crescent, the symbol of Islam. We'll talk about all three of these lights. But with the exception of those lights, it's the darkness of barbarism. Imagine that biker gangs with military weapons replaced the government of the United States, of Canada, and of Mexico. And that the entire mainland North American region north of Honduras was in the hands of these street gangs, these biker gangs. That's Europe. Instead of biker gangs, they're horse jockeys. It was the same thing. These barbarians on their horses take over the Roman world. They carve it up. Everything becomes more primitive. With that increasing primitivism comes the rise of barter, the loss of money economy, the loss of skills, because they're no longer relevant to survival. The Dark Ages last from the 400s, roughly, arguably, to somewhere in the 800s or 900s, even as late as the thousands. So it's a period of what, 400, 500, maybe 600 years in places. That's about half 1,000 years. That's a long time. That's a lot of generations. Assuming 5 generations, 20 years per century. It's 25 or more generations. But the Dark Ages do come to an end. Europeans begin building cities again. They begin building cathedrals. They begin building universities. They begin settling. The barbarians who are not Christians are driven out. The barbarians who have become Christians are accepted. The ante, the thing you have to pay to enter Western civilization, is you have to be Christian. Because if you're both Christian, there's a point of connection. You can treat each other in a Christian fashion. If there isn't that point, then you're probably still a bloodthirsty pagan who wants to put somebody on a sacrificial tree somewhere and disembowel them. The high Middle Ages come when Europe stabilizes. It's no longer being constantly invaded by a new biker gang on horseback. And that stabilization is the Christian faith. It is called Christendom. And the High Middle Ages is the first time our civilization after Rome really takes hold. But then in the 12 and 1300s, the climate gets colder. The world gets more dangerous. The plague comes. And suddenly the High Middle Ages become the Late Middle Ages, a time of increased warfare and starvation and disease, where it becomes harder and harder to stay alive. I'll try the fans off. Let's see how it goes. I know that some of you are chilled. I apologize. I need it to be somewhat cool in here. So the High Middle Ages devolves into the Late Middle Ages, but around 1450 in northern Italy, something sparkly happens. The Italians get a hold of a bunch of books from the Greek and Roman world. And they get a hold of knowledge from the Arab world. And this is going to inspire them to ask questions that haven't been asked in 1,000 years. The Renaissance is the rebirth of the ancient Greek and Roman knowledge in a new Christian society. It's the rediscovery of Greek philosophy and science, and it's the discovery of Arab medicine and science, which at that time was much more advanced than European. And so the Renaissance is this bubbling up of art and writing and culture, which is going to show Europe that there is hope to equal or even exceed the accomplishments of the ancients in the past. See, throughout the Middle Ages, you know what the Europeans live in the shadow of? They live in the shadows of the decaying ruins of Rome. Roads that go from horizon to horizon. Aqueducts that go from horizon to horizon. Former Romans, Europeans, live literally in the shadows of these collapsing, decaying ruins. But these ruins are so epic. They're so massive. The Europeans start telling themselves there were giants once in the world, and those giants built these things. They couldn't imagine men and women like themselves having anything to do with something that big. The Europeans literally forgot how to build a 3-story building during the Dark Ages. But in the Renaissance, that hope, that confidence, that sense that we as people can figure the world out, at least enough to make life better. We can equal the accomplishments of the ancient Greeks and Romans. We can overachieve, we can overcome what they did. We can make it better. We are wiser. We're Christian. We're 1,000 years further into history. And this is the step between this class and next year's European history class, which is going to end. This class is going to end in the Renaissance. European history is going to start in the Renaissance. And it extends into modern times. And I'll just give you a look ahead. Because Middle Ages between what? Between the ancient world up to the fall of the Western Empire. Now there are 2 events that end the Middle Ages. In 1453, the Eastern Roman Empire, the city of Constantinople, finally falls to the Islamic Turks. No longer is there an Eastern Rome. For 1,000 years, the Eastern Roman Empire had protected Europe from invasion. That's gone now. So the Muslims, early in modern times, are going to conquer much of southeastern Europe, driving hard towards Vienna, which is at the geographical heart of Europe. The other happens just about 50 years later, 40 years later. From 1453, fall of Constantinople, to 1492, what happens then? You all are culturally literate people. You should know what 1492 included. What happened? Yes.
He discovered the New World.
Columbus's discovery of America. And I do use that term. Oh, there were people here before him. Yes. There were Vikings from Europe. Yes. There were Indians before him. Yes. But Columbus's discovery changes history, the history of the entire planet. So Columbus, for better or worse, gets the credit. Either way, with the fall of Constantinople or the discovery of the Americas, really it's both, modern times begins. First thing that happens in modern times is the unifying component of medieval civilization, the Christian church, splinters, splits apart. Catholics, Protestants, Reformed Christians, unorganized Christians like Baptists, Anabaptists, Quakers, and Shakers, they all appear and fight one another in 150 years of religious war, Catholic v. Protestant v. Reformed. Yep, Europe undergoes a period of intense religious warfare. In the end, they agree to disagree, and the continent is split between Catholic and Protestant regions. It still is to this day. At about the same time, you have the Age of Discovery. Columbus, da Gama, Magellan, all sail where no European had ever sailed before. Excuse me. Charting the world's oceans, discovering new lands. And the only place the Europeans found that is more advanced than them is China and Japan and India. India is about the same level as Europe. China and Japan are far ahead, but they don't have ships. Europe does. And this is going to make a lot of difference. Anyway, the Age of Discovery is also including the Age of the Conquistadors. Conquistadors, who are they? They are the conquerors. Hernan Cortez conquers the Aztec Empire. Francisco Pizarro conquers the Inca Empire, both in the Americas. The Americas become mostly Spanish, a bit Portuguese. Then in North America, other powers like the English and the Dutch and the French show up. Concomitant with the late Age of Discovery is the scientific revolution. When Columbus sailed the ocean blue, everyone, educated people knew the world was round. Uneducated people thought it was flat, but everyone knew that the Earth was the center of the universe, and that the sun and the moon orbited the Earth, and the stars and the planets orbited the Earth. Everything orbited the Earth. Magellan sails around the entire planet, circumnavigates, believing that the sun and the moon are little round objects that orbit the Earth. Scientific revolution changes that concept into the notion that we're one of many planets and one of many solar systems. Eventually, the idea of the island universe or the galaxy comes along, and then multi-galaxies and multiple galactic clusters and so forth. The scientific revolution also goes small, into blood. Talk about those things. The Age of Absolutism. With the church fractured, the governments of Europe decide we can have total, unlimited power! And they try. The problem is their role models are China and Japan, countries where the people are used to being ruled closely by their governments. But Europeans have this strange notion we're free men under the king. Yeah, we have kings. Yeah, the kings rule over us. But we're free men. We have rights. The king guarantees and protects those rights. We serve him not because we're his property, but we're free men who are protecting our rights by serving our king. No king in Europe is going to get too involved in my personal life. If they do, they'll be sorry. So this attempt by European kings to become like Oriental monarchs in China and Japan is going to provoke first the Enlightenment, which is a bunch of philosophers talking about ideas like freedom. We hold these truths to be self-evident. All men are created equal, endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and property. Later changed to the pursuit of happiness by a Jefferson who didn't want his words to justify slavery. The Enlightenment inspires the Age of Revolution. And in America, we have a political revolution. We get rid of the king. We keep our free society. In France, they have a social revolution. They get rid of the king by executing him, and they then try to build a new utopian society. What they produce is a place where the streets literally run red with the blood of their victims. A never-ending terror practiced by the government on its own people. Ultimately, the Age of Revolution produces the dictator Napoleon and the Napoleonic Wars. Wars that stretch from the Atlantic Ocean to east of Moscow, where all of Europe is involved. After the fall of Napoleon, Humpty Dumpty, the world before the French Revolution, is attempted to be put back together again. But at that moment, we have the biggest change in human lifestyle since we learned how to farm. That is the Industrial Revolution. Muscle power is replaced by machine power. We have the growth of factories, water power, then coal power, then oil power. And suddenly, there's more than enough stuff for people. People can have enough food because the Industrial Revolution helps farming. Pollution goes up, yeah. Diseases go up, yeah. But medicine becomes more advanced. And there's so much hyperproduction of everything that when the Industrial Revolution begins, with all that filth, you'd think population goes down. No, population begins to go through the roof, and it's still going through the roof to this day. That's the Industrial Revolution, which leads to the Victorian era, or the age of European imperialism. Europe conquers the world in the late 1800s with industrial methods, steel battleships, cartridge firearms, rifles, bolt-action rifles, machine guns, the Maxim gun. Whatever happens, we have got the Maxim gun and they have not. Europe conquers the world. And quinine is important to that. Quinine is a drug that you take, or it's a mineral that you take, that keeps away malarial mosquitoes from killing you. Malaria is a sleeping sickness. It keeps the tropics from being occupied by Europeans, but that changes. When Europeans develop quinine, the world is conquered by Europe. What does Europe do with the world? It fights a series of world wars. Germany tries to take over the world not once, but twice within a 30-year period. They fail both times, but at great cost. And at the end of the Second World War, we develop atomic and then nuclear weapons. Uranium fission bombs and then hydrogen fusion bombs. Fission bombs can destroy human civilization, just like poison gas developed in World War I. Fusion bombs can destroy all life on Earth. Not even the cockroaches would have survived had there been a full-scale nuclear war when I was your age. When I was your age, there were over 50,000 nuclear weapons. 30,000 the Russians, 20,000 by us, and the French and the British had a few dozen. Yes?
I have a quick question. This is probably a really stupid one.
Oh, no. Go.
But why did Germany try more than once?
Well,
they didn't succeed.
The first time they tried, they thought that they were just better, stronger, faster, smarter than everyone else. They thought that the Russians were primitive and the English-speaking people were greedy. The Germans balanced a social conscience with material progress. And they were strong. They had more people than anyone else. They had better weapons than anyone else at the beginnings of the war. And they believed that they would stabilize Europe by becoming the chief nation of Europe. The British didn't want to let that happen, neither did the French or the Russians. But after that first attempt, the British and French and the Russians didn't treat the Germans very well. Carved away territory, treated them like schmucks, like scum, and forced the Germans to admit guilt for World War I. They weren't responsible for World War I. The Serbians, from what we now call Yugoslavia, they were responsible for World War I, but they were an ally of the British, French, and the Russians. No. The Germans didn't cause World War I, but they had to admit it. They were forced to admit it in the peace terms. They had their country carved up, and they had to pay massive amounts of money to the victors. This made them furious and poor, and the Nazis took over in that poverty, in that anger. Hitler was able to become the dictator of Germany. And Hitler believed that the world was composed of racial groups that were in a Darwinian struggle for survival. The Supermen were the Germanic Aryans, and the Swedes and the Norwegians, the Dutch and the Germans, and even the English. They were the Supermen. And then there were the servant races, the French and the Belgians, the Italians and the Spanish. And then there are the slave races, the Slavs of Eastern Europe and the blacks and the brown peoples of the rest of the world. And then there are the subhumans, the Untermenschen, the enemies of human beings, the human cancer cells, which Hitler calls the homosexuals, the gypsies, and especially the Jews. And Hitler, leading Germany, tries to take over the world to impose his sense of racial order on things. And he almost succeeds. He comes very close. It's scary how close he comes. So that's a short answer of why World War I and II. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. There's a lot more to come. You'll get that if you're with me next year, or even if you're not with me next year, with whoever teaches it. So the world wars are ended, but now there are atomic weapons in the world. what to do. Well, the two victors in World War II, the Americans and the Russians, look at each other suspiciously. The Russians want to make the world communist. The Americans want to stop this. The Americans become leaders of the free world, the Russians leaders of the communist world. And there's this ongoing, what's called a Cold War from 1944 till 1993. And in this Cold War, there are constant political battles, like going to the moon was about beating the Russians, like whose movies are better, whose music is better. But there's also, will the communists take over Italy again? Will they take over Greece? So that's a political battle, but also there's some fighting. And in places like Korea and Vietnam, our allies are fighting their allies. And soon we end up fighting them sort of at arm's length. But it never becomes a full-scale war, thank God. Why? Two reasons. One, the Russians who lived through World War I and World War II knew how horrible war could be. And they didn't want to go through that again. So the Russians never pushed things beyond a certain point with us. They'd push things right up to the edge of war, and then they'd back off. They were opportunists. They were like raccoons, as opposed to big cats or wolves. Raccoons are opportunists. They'll come, they'll take what they can, and they'll get away with it. The Russians never wanted to fight a full-scale nuclear war because, well, that would destroy them as well as us. Today, unfortunately, we face a Chinese communist leadership that has never experienced that kind of war or that kind of history. They have no knowledge of what war is really like. And they may miscalculate and assume that we are weak and stupid and easily pushed around. And they may try to conquer Taiwan, and they may try to conquer other places. And if they do, they'll discover that we are fighting people when we need to be. We don't like war, but we'll fight it if we have to. And that could bring about a final war. Hopefully not. It's called the Cold War between us and the Russians because it never becomes full. It never becomes a nuclear war. It never becomes a total war. It's limited. After the fall of the Soviets in the early 1990s, the period of the Islamic terrorism begins to happen in earnest, and it's the time of the war on terror, which we are still in now, where Islamic fundamentalism is trying to bring the world back to the Prophet Muhammad's time, and the rest of the world is trying to say no. So that's up to the point of now, the history of humanity in about 35 minutes, maybe 40 minutes. Not bad. So, Middle Ages between what and what? Between ancient times and modern times. Between the times of Greece and Rome and the times of the rise of Britain, France, and other countries to world dominance. Okay. One of the things that a lot of people enjoy is called fantasy. Fantasy novels, fantasy movies, like The Lord of the Rings. And The Lord of the Rings is set in sort of an idealized version of England in the Middle Ages. You've got farmers living in villages, they're hobbits, they lead nice, peaceful lives at a primitive level. They don't have much, their most advanced technology is a water wheel, maybe a windmill, which is the way it was in medieval Europe once the High Middle Ages happened. Today, from our hyper-technology society, we look back on the Middle Ages and we see a time that's peaceful and restful. It was not. Every waking moment was spent working, doing something because you needed to. One of the things that's true of the Middle Ages is there's not much long-distance trade. Basically, in this community, we'd have to provide everything we need ourselves. Everything. We wouldn't have the ability to trade and get food from all over the world like we do. We wouldn't be able to assume that we could get enough fuel to heat our homes from the rest of the world. No natural gas, no oil. Electrical power, if it continued at all, would have to be from local sources, local hydroelectric dams, local nuclear plant, local coal or oil plant. All of our food would have to be locally grown. What that would mean is during the wintertime, you don't get fresh fruit. You don't get fresh vegetables. Everything is canned. And I don't mean canned in a metal can, I mean canned in a jar in some kind of preservative. Often it's salt, like briny water, like pickles. Imagine all of your food pickled in the wintertime. Pickled meat, pickled vegetables. Lots of bread, not much meat, a little bit of dairy, more carbs than protein. We'd have to do it all ourselves. That's appealing to a lot of people. It's simple. You earn your way. You cut wood and you carry water, and you earn your daily survival by working hard. A lot of people who have romantic ideas about this have never worked a full day in their life. I worked on a farm when I was younger than you, and it is still the hardest physical job I have ever done in my life. It was a dairy farm. We mostly worked with the hay and the silage and bringing in the cows, and I was in incredible physical shape back in the Stone Age when dinosaurs ruled the world. I would never want to do that again if I didn't have to. And at my age, I'm not going to do that again, period. I don't have the energy that I once did. Don't worry, it'll happen to you. Just wait a few decades. In the meantime, enjoy being young. Or not. In any event, the idea of everything being local is also appealing for this reason. Have any of you ever done a lot of paperwork, filling out forms, applying for things? For example, did you fill out your application to come to charter, or did your parents? I would think that mostly your parents did.
I did a bit.
Good. I hope you each did a little bit, aside from just signing it. Um, there comes a point when you are a self-supporting adult where you're going to have to deal with the paperwork. It's obnoxious. So what a lot of people do is they imagine this idealized version of the Middle Ages where people are still clean, where they still have enough food, where disease doesn't kill people by age 25. They imagine a Middle Ages like Hobbit, living like Frodo Baggins or Bilbo Baggins at Bag End. And that is a beautiful, wonderful image of an ideal existence, but it's not realistic. There were nice things about living in medieval England or Germany or Poland or wherever. But it was hard work. Life was short. It was brutal. Most people died before they were 25. And they died of diseases and injuries that we wouldn't even break a sweat over. Because their medical technology largely consisted of, oh, you're sick? Here, let me take your arm. I'll slice open a vein and stick a leech on it. And it'll suck out the evil humors. Because that's what makes people sick, the evil humors. Of course, what that really does is sort of weaken the patient. But that's us. So there's this sense of isolation, this sense that we're on our own. And what can be appealing about it to people today is, okay, there are bandits in those hills. Let's have an adventure. All you men, we'll strap on some armor and we'll get some spears and some swords and some helmets. And yes, you women would not be going on this unless you were some kind of warrior princess of a Xena variety. And there were a few of them, but generally no. And you'd see us off, and we'd go off into the hills, and we'd fight the bandits with our own fists and our own spears, and some of us would die, and some of us would come back heroes. There's a purity in that that's very appealing to modern people who never experienced danger. Why do you think people bungee jump? Because we don't have many wars. Because it's a thrill. You risk your life to prove your bravery. Well, in a society that has this kind of backbreaking work and warfare, you don't have to go out of your way to do stuff like that. That stuff comes to you. You do not have the option of living safely. Nobody lives safely. Not in the Middle Ages. Not much now either. But it seems safer. So as we look at the Middle Ages, understand that there is a lot of romantic silliness about it. Times were simpler, food and water were less polluted, You have to earn your way through each and every day, and that's all true. But it was not easy. It was not pleasant. It was not clean. Imagine an outhouse, if you're lucky, at the back part of your house, not as a separate outhouse. You just get used to the smell. And the smell of unwashed bodies, because people didn't bathe more than once or twice a year. Need it or not, they'll go into the river once or twice a year by accident or on purpose. But other than that, people don't bathe the way we do. Imagine living in a world like that. So the Middle Ages does have this sense of isolation where you're on your own, and that is a part of it. Any questions, comments, or thoughts? Thank you for questions that were made, and you can talk quietly among yourselves. Thank you at home.